week. A couple of things we want to share. Last week, we're sorry there was a little bit of confusion that was a result of our internal communication. Kevin and I thought we were putting up a new bereavement group, and we had advertised it on our materials as an educational piece. So we kind of ended up with two different things going there. But this is going to be an educational series, which should help if you are working through your own grief as well. And if you are interested in an actual bereavement group, we are looking to put one of those together online. Simply let Kenya or Kevin or I know. Kevin Westbrooks, who's also, you'll see Kevin is also bereavement counselor for Harmony Hospice. And Kevin is actually the host for this, and he'll be managing the screen. He'll also be watching the chat. So if you have a question, we'd invite you to put it up on the chat. Kevin will then interrupt me, which he is always happy to do because I tend to talk more than he gets to talk. And he will interrupt me with your question, and we'll attempt to address it at that time. Does that make sense to everyone?
Mm-hmm.
Great. As I said earlier, we're not muting anybody. You have control of yours. Last week we muted everybody, and it caused myriad of problems for a number of us trying to figure out when we were muted and when we weren't. The other thing to let you know is we are recording this session. We will be recording sessions. Towards the end of our time together, we will stop recording. And at that point, if there are personal questions or things that you would like to ask that you don't particularly want up on the recording, we'll be able to do that without recording. Is that clear to everyone? So everybody is aware of that. Well, good. So welcome to session 2. The thing that you have up on the screen right now that Kevin has up for us is our leader's guide that we use in our program. And this session 2 talks about managing difficult emotions. And in it, we would normally review the norms. Anytime you have a group, if you're trained in group work, you would know you establish norms for the group, which are normative behaviors and processes and how we go through things. So we always review those norms to help people remember how to interrupt, how to ask questions, how to give good feedback without being negative and without being critical, and to allow people to have their own space to grieve and work as they want to do. And if you are leading grief work or you're working with someone, you want to remind them that they are comfortable, that there is no right or wrong way to grieve, that their way is appropriate, and we never want to be critical of how someone is addressing their grief. We would review the emotions worksheet. We're going to do that. Last week, those of you who got the material, in there was a list of emotions. Actually, that's a list of emotions and expressions of emotions. We're going to talk in just a few minutes about emotions and about the 8 emotions that truly are solid emotions that exist. So we're going to talk about those in just a few minutes. What Kevin has brought up right now, Kevin, if you'll now go on back. Kevin, go back down. Go back down to the article. There we go. So this is an article that you will receive after today, and it's one that we have that we use, and it's a good guide for helping people to understand and helping them to look at how to work through their grief. The article says, there is no grief that time does not lessen and soften. That's true. As we said last week, grief never goes away, and it's an important thing when you're working with folks to help them to understand that the grief they're feeling is never going to go away. Time does not erase our grief. What it does is it lessens the impact of it and moves it from center stage of our thinking in our life to a lower stage, to a back door, to where we are. It's in the recesses of our mind. But it will come forward again, and there are things that will trigger it. There are things that will cause it to happen again, and sometimes we can feel it as strongly when that happens as we did in the initial. Does that make sense? Everybody with me?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So one of the things we want to do is provide gentle self-care when grief is fresh. One of the things to help people remember is you've got to take care of yourself. So many people and people who are working with others can end up not taking care of yourself and not taking care of yourself when you're grieving. People will forget to eat. They will forget to hydrate. They will isolate. They will do other things that don't cause them to take care of themselves. So you need to take care of yourself as a grief counselor, as a caregiver, but you also, in the middle of your grief, need to make sure that you take care of yourself. If you're flying in an airplane and they're doing all the, the exits are over here and all of these sort of things, one of the things they will say always is, should there be depressurization and the masks drop, somebody tell me, what is the first thing they tell you to do?
Put on yourself.
You put on your own mask, because you cannot help someone to breathe if you can't breathe. So one of the keys is to make sure you take care of yourself. Make sure you hydrate, make sure you get rest, make sure you eat. The body requires fuel to function, just like any other machine. And a lot of times in grief, people will initially forget to eat. Sometimes in trying to manage their emotions, they will overeat, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. The second one is accept your feelings. We're going to talk about feelings and emotions in a few minutes, but accepting again that they're real, that they're a part of it, and that is a normal thing, and the way you feel is the way you feel. It doesn't matter how anybody else feels. It's how you feel in your grief. So never let anybody tell you that you should feel a certain way in your grief, or never tell anybody that the way they're feeling is not appropriate. Now, that can be hard because sometimes the way people will talk about their grief can be a difficult thing for us to support and understand, but their feeling, the way they feel, is the way they feel. You need to take care of your entire body. Folks in grief need to take care of their entire body, their physical body, their mind, their spirit. Whether they are people of faith, everyone has a spirit and everyone has some nature of spirituality. And so that needs to be fed and needs to be nurtured as well. We talked last week about the levels of grief. The basic level of grief in which most of us can kind of handle that ourselves. And then there's more difficult grief where we begin to need help with it. And then there's complicated grief where if we have more than one loss within a year to 18 months, we're dealing with complicated grief. And complicated grief impacts us in such a way, and there's so much loaded onto it, and there's so much intensity to it, that we really need help with it, either in a bereavement group or with counseling. It doesn't mean you have to go into counseling for 14 years to deal with it. But it also, complicated grief also rips open old wounds from old griefs that we felt like we dealt with. And we find ourselves reliving things that we thought were past and done with our life, and they're brought back. Because as I said at the beginning, grief never goes away, it recedes. But there are things that bring it up. And complicated grief causes us to have a whole lot. It's like going for a hike. If you go out for a hike and you grab your backpack and you throw in a bottle of water and you throw in a protein bar and you hike up the hill. But the next time you go, you say, there really wasn't enough water, so I better take a couple of gallons of water, and I better take a first aid kit because I skinned my knee the last time. Now, all of a sudden, that backpack weighs a whole lot more, and it's harder to get up the hill. And then you realize that you live in Arizona, so you better take 5 gallons of water, and you really need to take a lunch as well as the protein bar, and you need the compass, and all of a sudden your backpack weighs 25 to 30 pounds, and then try to run up the hill with a 25, 30-pound backpack. It's gotten really heavy. That's the same way grief builds up with us. We need to look at making adjustments. When we're suffering grief and when someone's suffering grief, there are adjustments that need to be made in their life. It's a perfect example right now. As I shared last week, we are all in the middle of dealing with anticipatory grief. Anticipatory grief is that grief that happens when we get the diagnosis or when we're informed of some event happening that's a difficult event. And from that point till it ends, till the death or till the actual event happens and we come to the post-event grief, we are in grief and we are struggling with it. And it gets worse as time goes along because we don't know when it's going to end. Right now, more and more studies are being done and more articles are being written that all of us in this coronavirus time, with our isolation, with our separation, with all of the things that are happening, are suffering anticipatory grief. And so we need to be prepared to make adjustments because things are different and things are challenging, and our emotions and our strength and our physicality are all challenged. So we need to make adjustments with that. Any questions, thoughts at the moment, Kevin? Anything on chat that I need to address? So if it's making sense, will you all give me a thumbs up where I can see if I'm making sense there so that I can see that? Okay, thank you.
Murray, the only thing on the chat is Maureen's interest in having a grief group.
Okay, so we've got that, we know that, and so we'll make sure that we remember that. One of the things that we want to do in grief work is embrace our emotions, our memories. Embrace our memories, because they can help us, they can challenge us, they can free us. They can also cause us to know areas that we need to deal with. Later on in this session, we're going to talk about forgiveness and the 3 elements of forgiveness, and we're going to talk about how those play into it. And often in grief, we need to forgive the person that's died, which is one of those irrational things that we have. We need to forgive them. We need to forgive things that were in that relationship. And often, quite often, we need to forgive ourselves for things in the relationship that we're feeling where we were inadequate. But we're going to talk about that in a later session. You want to go ahead and scroll on down, Kevin, for me? One of the things that we're going to talk about in a whole session will be preparing for holidays and special events and those sort of things, because often we find ourselves coming up on an anniversary of an event, or we're coming to a big holiday. I don't know how many of you are big Christmas people. You know, if you're a big time, Christmas is supposed to be that wonderful, joyous time when everybody celebrates and everything is wonderful and all of these marvelous things, and you've lost somebody at Christmas time. This past year, we actually had 1 or 2 people who died either the day before or at Christmas itself. Now, all of a sudden, that impacts this wonderful, joyous time it's supposed to be. Or you get invited to events, and even in the middle of grief at a normal time, someone's having a birthday. You don't feel like going. You don't feel like dealing with this. How do we manage it? We're going to have a whole session where we talk about how to manage special occasions and how to do with that. So the first thing we want to talk about is emotions. So I'm going to share a little bit of some things here that we've got a sheet that we don't have up, but is one that we will be getting out to you. The word emotion is from the Latin emovere, to move out, remove, agitate. It's tied to the Latin word instinctus, from which we get instinct, which is impulse. In English, we have more than 400 words assigned to emotions and sentiments. Now, can you imagine how difficult that is sometimes for us to deal with all that when we have 400 words that we use for that? A couple of things about emotions. Emotions are electrochemical signals that flow through us in an unending cycle. They're always there. We don't necessarily always think about our emotions and about emotions being there until we become, quote unquote, emotional about something. But the reality is, right now, you're having an emotion. You're sensing emotions, and it's going through your system, and it can take as little as 2 or 3 seconds for that emotion to move through. They're released in our brains in response to our perceptions of the world, and we feel them all the time. A great study was done on this by Robert Poltich in 1980. So if you're interested, you can always look that up. It's Plutchik, Robert, and he did a major study on that in 1980, which has become kind of a classic that we use in talking about emotions. Researchers note that when concealing a strong emotion, people tend to let out micro expressions, quote unquote, of sudden leakages of emotional, unbeknownst to themselves, very briefly, in as little as a 24th of a second. In other words, you may think that you're really good at hiding your emotions, and many people feel they are, but quite often we let little slips, little things pop out that betray the emotion we're having. It's like the person who says, I'm doing really well, but you look at them and what comes across in their nonverbal really says to you, I don't think that person is doing so well. It's one of the things that we use in teaching communication. We ask people how much that you communicate is in the words you use. And people will use large amounts like 50%, 60%, 100%. The truth is only 7 to 11% of what we communicate is in the words we use. So much more of it is in tone and volume and nonverbals that let us know what we're really doing. There are 8 basic emotions. Now, the sheet that we sent out to you, and those of you who didn't get it will get, has a whole list of emotions and expansions of types of expression of those emotions. But the 8 basic emotions are joy, sadness, fear, disgust, surprise, anticipation, anger, and trust. Now, there are countless variations and nuances of those, and in the sheet that we provided, you see a lot of those. But again, those are the 8 basic emotions that studies have shown are really the foundation of our emotional life. Again, joy, sadness, fear, disgust, surprise, anticipation, anger, and trust. A key thing to remind, and especially if you're working with people, is remind them that emotions are neither good nor bad. Emotions in themselves are neutral. It's what we do with them. One of the things that happens is people don't get angry, or they refuse to get angry. They refuse to admit that they're angry because being angry is bad. No, being angry is not bad. Being angry is not wrong. Being angry is not a sin. Being angry is a natural emotion that happens. The reason we don't like anger is because of the way it's expressed so often. It's what people do with it. People get angry and they yell, they shout, they hit, they become abusive, they lash out. And so what we don't like isn't the anger. What we don't like is the expression. And so one of the keys for folks is to help them in dealing with grief to understand that the emotions they feel are neither good nor bad. They're not something to be to deny, to be afraid of. It's just to understand that it's what we do with them and how we work with them. Making sense? Let me see those thumbs if I am. Okay, good. Thank you. So a few more things about emotions before we get to the sheet that Kevin has up for us. Emotions function to guide us to survive and thrive. Emotions focus our attention and motivate us towards a specific course of action. Each emotion in our life has a purpose. Fear has a purpose. Joy has a purpose. Anticipation has a purpose. And again, they are there to help us focus. And so they're constantly working in our life. And that's a key for folks to remember, is that emotions are always with us. Another thing to remember is that emotions are contagious. Feelings spread between people like a virus. Not sure that I probably ought to say that at this point with the virus thing, but even if we're not paying attention to emotions, when we're in a group and with other people, we can catch both positive and difficult emotions. A great example of that is when people are at a funeral and somebody says, you know, I don't get emotional. I don't normally cry. I don't know why I'm crying. I don't even particularly feel sad. Well, part of crying is a stress relief, but the other thing is, if everybody around you is crying, you tend to catch that. If everybody else around you is laughing, you tend to catch that. Have you noticed that in your own lives? So emotions are contagious. They go around. And so what the other thing that they can be contagious with is that we learn how to express our emotions. If you grew up in a family where emotions were expressed quickly and loudly and often, you probably had one of two reactions. You either became that kind of person or you became the person who kind of cowered away and hid. If you came up in a family where people didn't express their emotions at all, the probability is that you learn not to be expressive with your emotions. Or you could have been that rebel that ran through the house shouting with joy, but got into trouble for it all the time. So emotions are that. Now, any questions, any thoughts, any questions or anything on emotions at this point, or on the basic emotions that we talked about, the 8 basic emotions? You see anything, Kevin?
Nothing yet.
Okay. Well, either I'm brilliant or, I'm not sure what's happening today. So we're going to move on. So the sheet that Kevin now has up for us to look at is a sheet that we use. And if you're working with people, is a great sheet for you to use with them to talk about what we do with our emotions. So as you see, here's this picture, this lovely picture of the gentleman with his dog. And you look at the smile on his face because that dog is bringing him an emotional response that he's feeling. And you see your emotions, anger, anxiety, fear, sadness, as we talked about, joy. So you pay attention to your emotions because one of the things to do us in grief is to pay attention to our emotions, not to try to ignore them or to avoid them. People, especially who are people who have come up in a situation where they don't acknowledge their emotions, they don't spend a lot of time dealing with their emotions, will tend to try to ignore them. And if they're feeling all of a sudden these stronger emotions, they begin to think it's not normal. This is not normal. But remember, we talked a few minutes ago about the fact that in grief, things are changing and we have to adjust to the change. And while you may not be someone who experiences and aware of your emotions a lot, it is normal to have them. And so you begin to look at them and say, okay, how do I deal with these? So let's go over to the box on the left-hand side. Emotion is normal. So when we accept that emotions are normal, there are several responses. 1, we accept it. 2, we express them. And 3, we hopefully experience validation. One of the tough things for people in grief is to help them to understand that the emotion that they're feeling, and they may be cycling rapidly through emotions. We have a handout that we'll give you later on in the course that's the ball of emotions. And it's this tangle. It looks like somebody took thread and just balled it all up in a big ball. And it's all these emotions. And we bounce from one another and bounce from one another. What we want people to do is validate the experience of their emotions. And so if they're feeling joyous, it's okay. And if they're feeling angry, it's okay. And if they've gone from anger to joy in 5 minutes, they're not going crazy. They're just dealing with this volatile soup that we're swimming in. I think last week, Kevin, did I talk about change going from solid to liquid to solid? Do you remember?
I don't think we did.
What's that?
I don't think we did.
Okay, well, let me talk about that. One of the things that we're doing when we're in the middle of grief is we're experiencing real change. Change is best described by many as we're standing on a solid base. You've got a platform here, and you're standing on that platform, and everything is there and it's solid. All of a sudden, something knocks that out, and what happens to you? You fall down into this void, or like being dumped all of a sudden into the middle of the ocean. And there's nothing solid to hold on to, and you're treading water and you're thrashing around. And that's where we are in the middle of change. It's this volatile area of nothing solid to hold on to. And you struggle in there until you finally find a little rock or a little pebble, and you build on that till it becomes a new foundation, and then you're able to stand on it, and you found your new normal, a place of solidity. So experiencing these emotions and allowing yourself to understand that they're valid, even ones that seem strange. One of the most difficult ones for some people is joy in the middle of grief. I don't know how many times we talk with people and they have a difficult time with joy in the middle of grief. How can I be joyous when I've just lost my father, my mother, somebody that I really care about? How can I possibly be joyous? Well, because not all joy is taken out of the world. There are things that can bring us joy in the midst of it. Now, you want to back that down a little bit more, Kevin, because I think we've got where we're missing part of the box there. Nope, the other way. Go the other way. Thank you. Right there. Oh, nope. Go back up. There. Right there. Stop. There we go. Thank you. So one of the other areas that we would talk to people about is look at emotional avoidance. People will start to avoid in grief their emotions many times. And one of the ways that can happen is to space out. You know, it's that look in somebody's eyes. You know, we say, you know, the lights are on, but nobody's home. That 1,000-yard stare, they call it, where all of a sudden it's become so intense that we just kind of shut down. The worst of that is a condition called catatonia, where people become catatonic and they completely go away. But for us, sometimes the emotions are so strong that we just kind of space out. And let people know that that may well happen, and it's okay, and don't be afraid of it. One of the other things that people can do is they can begin to binge. And this can be all right. You know, if all of a sudden you feel like you want to eat 2 donuts instead of 1, or you want to have 2 big pieces of chocolate cake when you don't normally eat chocolate cake in the middle of the week, it's okay. But not okay if that becomes what we're doing constantly. One of the things that can happen is people can begin to self-medicate. And so we want to be aware of that, and we want to help them to be aware not to become self-medicators. And food can be a self-medication, as can isolation. But alcohol and other forms of drugs can become a way of trying to escape. And if you feel like you want to have 1 day of too much, that's okay. But not when it becomes a regular thing. Because what that does is does not allow you to work through the pain and work through the emotion and work through the struggle. So one of the things when you're working with people, either yourself or with anyone else, is to make sure that you check back. How are you doing? How are you doing with your eating? How are you doing with your use of any kind of thing that anesthetizes you? Because you don't want that to become that. People will say they feel numb. Well, feeling numb can sometimes be all right for the short term when the emotions are too strong. But allowing numbness to become a way of shutting out the pain and the frustration and the hurt becomes a way of not dealing with the grief. And that is never healthy. That's going to lead to other difficulties because what we do emotionally, what we do spiritually impacts us physically the same as the other ways around. And if we don't do the work, if we don't work through our emotions, it will come out in other ways. It will come out in stress. It will come out in problems that can cause us then to become physically ill. And people will say often in grief that they feel physically ill. And that's a normal kind of reaction. The difficulty becomes when we allow that to become such a thing that it actually begins to cause physical problems for us. I'm going to talk in just a few minutes about stress and about some of those things. Another area that folks can fall into is negative interpretations of emotions. 1, I feel ashamed and guilty about my feelings. Guilt is one of those things that very rarely is productive. It can help us if it helps us to move towards dealing with problems, if it can help us to realize that there needs to be forgiveness, either of ourselves or others, it can be productive. But when it becomes the overreaching thing that prevents us from addressing our feelings, from addressing the issues, from doing the work, it is not helpful. And so one of the things we want to deal with, and we often have people talk about guilt. I feel guilty because I didn't do enough. I feel guilty because I wasn't there. I feel guilty because, and the list can go on and on and on. And so one of the things that has to be addressed in grief is dealing with guilt, dealing with our guilt, dealing with the guilt that we have, dealing with the guilt of the feelings that we're having, which we should never do. I repeat that. We should never allow ourselves to feel guilty about the other feelings we're having because they're natural. Make sense? Okay. This other one is nobody has feelings like mine. Now, somebody who feels bold, how about telling me, why do you think that would be a problem to allow people you're working with or for you to feel that way, to say, no one has feelings like mine?
Not true.
Yeah, because it's not true. First of all, it's not true. Everybody has feelings. And the other thing is, it begins us to start feeling like there's something wrong with us if we're the only ones that have this feeling. It can cause us to isolate. It can cause us not to talk to others. It can cause us to say, nobody can help me because nobody understands. But it's not true. And so we don't want to allow people to move into that. We don't want to allow ourselves to move into that. Now, nobody that I know of may express their feelings like I do. That could well be. But that doesn't mean that nobody expresses them like you do. I shouldn't have mixed feelings. We talked about that a few minutes ago, this ball of emotional and confusion and stuff. No, you should have mixed feelings because your feelings are what they are. I cannot accept my emotions. Difficult for some people. But again, it is a negative interpretation of emotions. And usually it comes from people who've been taught that a certain emotion is in of itself bad, which we began the session by saying they aren't. It's what we do with them. It's how we express them. And anger is one of those. For some people, even joy has been told that, that they've been taught that joy is not a good thing. Now, that's hard to believe for most of us, but there are people that I have worked with and people I know. The last one here is one that many people have. I should always be rational. No, you shouldn't. No, you shouldn't. No one should always be rational, because to be rational is to deny that we have an emotional self, to deny that we have a creative self, to deny that we have a loving, needy self. So these are areas where we can do negativity. So let's go back over to emotion is normal. We get those, we accept, express, experience. We got the emotional where we space out, where the avoidance, space out, binge, eat, drink, use drugs, numbness. Which leads us, along with the ones we've just done, down to the next box. I might lose control. Now, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but I'm guessing, looking at the number of people I see that have joined us in this group, that of this group, there's at least one or two people who are concerned about losing control. Don't anybody jump up and say me, except Kevin, because Kevin's always concerned about losing control, which is not true.
I wanted to add one comment that someone put on the chat.
Okay.
They say for addicts, one day of having enough is not good. The addict will have crossed down the rabbit hole. They must contact the person in the program to be with them.
Yes, you're exactly right. And we, getting into those specific things. But yes, if a person has an addiction to whatever the addiction is, and we often think of addictions with drugs, and I always say drugs because alcohol is a drug. So I don't say drugs and alcohol. They go together, having trained as an addiction counselor. But if someone has an addiction, and that addiction can be to sex, it can be to any form of thing that takes control of us and that we give ourselves over to. If we have an addiction, then yes, allowing ourselves to go there is going to be a problem. So we need to make sure that in times of grief, if you know you have an addiction to whatever, make sure that you contact that person who is your key support or that group. So thank you for whoever brought that up. That is an excellent point. We do want to make sure that we understand that. So this concept of I might lose control. For an addict, I might lose control. Well, that's why we want to deal with things and why we want to work with things. These feelings will last forever. While grief lasts forever, the feelings, the emotion that we have recedes. And it goes back to where it's not always there. It kind of filters back and finds a little spot in the back of our brain and kind of hangs out there. But we don't want to fool ourselves to think that we'll never experience again, because we will. There are things that trigger and bring the grief back to us. But we know we've done the work if it recedes quickly. So when it's triggered, when it bounces back in front of us, it recedes quickly, and we know that we've done the work. One of the other things that we go down to the next box is you ruminate, chewing it over and over. There's a difference between working it and worrying it. Does everybody understand that difference between working it and worrying it? Worrying it is you just roll it over and you just kind of beat yourself up and all those other things. Working it is trying to understand and do the things that move it along to where it needs to be. You begin to just worry. I worry that I'm never going to get over this. I worry that I'm not doing it right. So we want to make sure that we help people to understand that how you're doing it is how you do it. You avoid situations that elicit emotions. One of the things that can happen in grief is we don't want people to see us cry. We don't want people to think we're weak. We don't want people to experience these things. So we avoid all kinds of things. We avoid conversations that we should have. We avoid doing group work. We avoid counseling. We avoid being even honest with ourselves sometimes because we don't want people to see us being emotional, see us with the expression of our emotions. The other thing that can happen is we can start to blame other people, including where someone has died. We blame them. If you hadn't died, I wouldn't be like this. Well, might be true, might not be true. Might be something else that caused you to be like that. But the reality is, it is what you are and it's what you're experiencing. So for just a minute, I want to talk about this material that we're going to bring up that you'll get on 5 things you should know about stress. While stress is a natural and regular human reaction, everyone feels, quote unquote, stressed from time to time. But what is stress and how does it affect your overall health? Stress is how the brain and body respond to any demand, any type of challenge, such as a performance at work or school, significant life change, traumatic event. All of these produce an additional level of stress. We all have stress every day. If we didn't have any stress, we probably would never get up and get around and do anything. Stress can affect your health. It's important to pay attention to how you deal with minor and major stresses so you know when to seek help. 5 things to know. Stress affects everyone. Everyone experiences stress. It's just a natural part of life. There are different types of stress, all of which carry physical and mental health risks. A stressor may be a one-time, short-term occurrence, or it can happen repeatedly over long times and many things. Some examples of routine stress. Where'd I go here? Routine stress is related to pressures of school, work, family, other major responsibilities. Stress brought about by sudden negative change, such as losing a job, divorce, illness, death. Traumatic stress experienced during an event such as a major accident, war, coronavirus, the loss of somebody, people being killed. Traumatic stress may have very distressing temporary emotional and physical symptoms, but most recover naturally soon after. There are lots of articles about that. Remember, not all stress is bad. We talk about stress and we act as if all stress is bad, but all stress is not bad. Stress can be helpful to us. It causes us, it motivates us. It can be a positive thing, causing us to be creative and do things to manage it. Long-term stress can be hazardous to you, harmful to your health. Coping with the impact of chronic stress can be challenging, but such long-term stress is more consistent than acute stress. There are ways to manage stress. And the best ways to do it are, first of all, be observant. Recognize the signs of stress that come for you, because we all have different ways that stress impacts us. So we recognize the stress and be aware of it, and be aware when we're experiencing more of that. Don't be afraid to talk to your health practitioner, your doctor, counselor, friend, a wise person who can help you. One of the things to get is regular exercise. In grief, sometimes we begin to shut down and we don't take care of ourselves and we don't get the physical exercise. Physical exercise burns off stress. Now, for all of us, it's different levels of what that exercise is. Find some relaxing activity. Now, for some people, that's a different thing. And so I don't tell you. For some people, yoga is really relaxing. For others, yoga is stressful because, you know, you try to bend and stretch into positions that just don't come naturally for you. For some of us, sitting and reading a tome that's, 6,000 pages there with a dictionary where we have to look up the words we don't know is relaxing. For other people, that's just like going back to school and isn't there. So find that helps you to relax. Stay connected. Connect with those who understand you, who can help you. If you're overwhelmed by stress, you find yourself overwhelmed by stress, being overloaded with it, seek help. Seek help. Talk to your doctor, talk to a counselor, get someone who can help you with it. But stress is going to be a part of grief. Extreme stress is often a major element in strong grief. Okay, Kevin, you want to slide on down? So in our sessions, we have some activities. Go ahead, on down, Kev. The first one that we have that we encourage people to do is our grief emotions worksheet. This is a worksheet that you can do, that folks can do, has a date, the name of the grief emotion you are feeling the strongest at this time. So if we were in a session, I'd say to you, Yvonne, Deva, Veronica, Maureen, what's the strongest emotion that you're feeling at the moment? So you just write that down don't overthink it. Don't try to analyze it. Just write down that emotion, the strongest emotion you're feeling at that time. Then we go, if it could be seen, just how would you describe its features? And what we do is ask people to think about that. So if I'm experiencing anger, what is that anger? What are the features of that anger? Maybe it's got horns. Maybe it's got big teeth. Maybe it's a particular color. Maybe it's got grasping tentacles that are out there. Whatever it is, you write those down. And then go ahead, bring it up a little further, Kevin. Then what we say is, now, what would it look like? Draw the picture. Now, this is sometimes challenging for folks because if you're like I am, you're not much of an artist. And you find yourself saying, but we say, just go ahead. It doesn't matter. This is not art class. This is an object for you to draw it and express it and put it together. And then we ask people to share it around and look at it. And it's amazing how many times people will say, man, if that was the emotion that I was feeling right now, that's what it would look like too. And then we go on to the next stage, which is part of working the emotion. What would it take to make the change? What would it make to change it? Oh, did we jump down too far? Did I miss the first drawing, Kevin? Are there two drawings there? I think there are, aren't there? Yes. The first, go back up. The first drawing. Go on. Yep. A little more. The first drawing, you can leave it right there. The first drawing is what it looks like now. The second drawing we ask people to do is, if you were to adjust it, what would it look like? If you could make it be the picture of that emotion that you'd want that emotion to look like, what would it look like? And so you give people a chance, to time, they draw then a different emotion. So it might be anger that shows me creating a vaccine to take care of coronavirus. Because as we tell people, when Louis Pasteur got angry because his neighbor boy was bitten by a dog, got rabies, he went into his laboratory and developed a vaccine for rabies. So anger can motivate us. Any emotion can motivate us to do a certain thing. So I would draw a picture of my anger in a different way that says, this is what I would want it to look like. And then we go down to the lines that are there. So what would it take to make that change? And so the individual who's working through their grief stops and thinks about it. What would I have to do to change this emotion from where it's there to what I want it to look like? What would it take? And what are the steps it would take? Excuse me just a second. And then we would encourage them to go ahead and take those steps. Any questions on that sheet and how you would use it? How you might use it yourself? Anything, Kevin?
Nothing yet.
Okay. Well, let's move on down then.
Excuse us.
Yes.
I don't know if you could see the chat, but my husband Michael had a question.
Okay. What is that
Oh,
question?
it was this on the last piece you covered, and then touched on it before, and it's kind of where I'm falling in with one parent gone now and another struggling, is with anticipatory grief. How do you balance that with the need not to ruminate or worry constantly about what's going to happen?
Yeah, that's it. We do an entire workshop on anticipatory grief, and that's coming up.
Well, by its very nature, you're anticipating something, you're constantly ruminating or worrying about it, and I don't know how you can break that, if you can even break that cycle, but it's destructive.
It can be, and with anticipatory grief, the difficulty with it, Michael, as you're experiencing, is that it gets worse as time goes along.
Yes.
The longer it goes, the more difficult it becomes. And so what we say to folks with anticipatory grief is two things. One, things that help with it are, and I'm trying to pull all of that out of my brain at the moment. If you send me an email, and Kevin, is our emails up on the chat right now?
They're not, but I'll put them up there.
If you put them up, Kevin will put them up. If you send me an email, I will send you a list of things that we talk about in the anticipatory grief workshop that are ways to enrich the time and make it helpful, which help you not to ruminate on it so much, not to worry about it, but action steps to do. Part of the things that anticipatory grief can do is cause us to look at how we enrich the relationship that exists. So one of the things that I do, my wife has metastatic breast cancer, and she's fortunately doing very well. Her medications are doing things and everything is great. But I go to Starbucks every morning and I get a venti black iced tea lemonade with no liquid sugar and 2 Splenda. And I bring it back and I put it into her cup now and I leave it on her bedside bed. Because I'm an early morning guy and my Deb is a night owl. So when she wakes up and I've gotten up and around, she has a iced tea lemonade that helps to cut some phlegm and stuff in her throat. And it says to her, I love you. And I know that I've done that to make her life a little more rich. Does that make sense, Michael?
It does. It does. And fortunately, you're there with her. Or this virus thing is just throwing a dark veil over everything, where I was with my dad up until a month ago, and then he passed, and then my mom is I was totally committed visiting with them, and it just, I know that's a unique thing, and no one could have anticipated this even a month and a half ago, but it just makes it tough because you're so committed to be there with them, and even though you're anticipating the inevitability that we all face, to have that then taken away after you're so committed, it just really has driven it deep and dark, and it's made the phone, actually the telephone, like a torture device.
Yes.
Because you're getting the call from the hospital, you're getting the call from the nursing home, and it's really insidious and terrible.
It is. It is.
I
And
try to be rational about it and know that all things come to pass and everyone experiences this, but you just can't help but dwell and dwell and dwell and wait for the next phone call. So
yeah. Yeah, and it is difficult. And so I would encourage you, check on our Facebook page and check on the website and send me some note, and I'll send you some materials, and would invite you to take part in that anticipatory grief session, because I think it will help some.
Thank you.
But the other thing that you can do, when you send me an email, we can arrange to have a conversation on phone, and I can share some things with you there individually as well.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay, so Kevin, you want to slide on down here?
Can I just add one thing?
Yes. Yvonne.
And it's sort of a way of reframing what you said as well. If you can do something, to move forward, something concrete, it helps you to focus.
Yes.
Because with the ruminating, you're going in all directions. Your mind is considering all things, and that's not particularly useful. Whereas if you focus on what can you do,
Yes.
Yeah,
Thank you, Yvonne, because that's very true. And there are tangible things that we can do, even in a situation like with your mother, Michael, where we can do that. So this next activity, did you just close off your share there, Kevin?
I didn't mean to do that.
Okay, well, Kevin, that's all right. We can talk without it being there. Kevin had just brought up, and some of you may have noticed that there was a pink heart there, and it said the crumpled heart. It is an activity that we use in our grief groups, and you'll get this thing where we actually have a heart cut out, a heart shape. And we have people write on it their fears, their emotions, their various things, and then we have them crumple it. We have them crumple it all up, and then they pull it out. And all of a sudden, from this lovely, pristine heart, you have this thing that's got all these creases in it and everything else. Well, that's what the emotion in our grief does to our emotional heart. It causes us to have wounds. It causes us to have crumples and breaks in our heart. And it becomes a tangible thing to say, yes, those are there, but we can still have a functional heart that has the wounds in it. Does that make sense when I say that?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So you begin to say, and so it says like, this is a tool that helps me to remind, yes, this has happened to me, but my heart still works. My emotional heart can still work. There's still hope. There can still be joy. There can still be peace in my life. So it's just another tool that we have for that. We are coming up on the hour mark, and we try to be faithful to your time. We appreciate you being with us. So Kenya, at this point, I think we're going to shut off the recording,